My name is Joe Granja. I've been focusing on the OAuth 2 OpenID Connect support and Spring Security and Spring Authorization Server for like decades. Not decades, but quite a few years. Today we're going to be talking about MCP authorization, so Model Context Protocol, right? In the Model Context Protocol specification, there's an authorization part of the specification. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm not going to be talking about MCP overall, but Dan Vega's talk. I don't know if you guys went to Dan Vega's talk yesterday. Excellent talk. If you didn't, check out his talk whenever the talk gets published. Really good talk. So yeah, we're going to be focusing on the MCP authorization spec. I want to just gauge the audience and who's used OAuth 2 client and OAuth 2 resource server support and Spring Security. Okay. And how about Spring Authorization Server? But of course you have. All right. And how about MCP? Have you used MCP? Yeah? Okay. All right. So yeah, let's get into it. So we're gonna talk about. I gotta put this disclaimer first because there's actually some new features that we're looking to introduce in Spring Security and Spring Authorization Server that are not in the release right now. So it's in this demo repository. I'm going to be showing a lot of code today. So it's in this demo repository, so I got to show this. You know, what I'm going to show you, what's in the demo might change before we actually release this in one of the versions. Okay, so MCP authorization. So if you look, has anyone looked at the, oh, it's not going. Let me make sure here I'm on demo. I am on demo. Okay, there he goes. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah. Okay, there's a disclaimer. Read that, done. Okay, so the MCP authorization spec it's divided into a few sections, right? Authorization server discovery, dynamic client registration, the authorization grant flow, and then token audience binding and validation, right? So the idea here, right? The goal of the authorization specification is to realize the use case where, okay, I'm on Claude Desktop, let's say, the host application, right? And I discover an MCP server that I want to add to Claude Desktop. And we're going to call it, because in my sample I have the weather service, right? I'm going to get the current weather, right? So I want to be able to add that MCP server, you know, in Claude Desktop and then ask for the current weather, right? So in order to be able to do that, and if that MCP server is an OAuth 2 protected resource, I need an access token. How am I going to do that, right? Typically, you go to, if you're accessing Google APIs, you go to your Google console, you add your client credentials, and then you use the token, right? Or use the client credentials to get the token. But how do you do that when you're dynamically discovering and adding MCP servers? That's what this spec is all about, right? It's all about, first I need to discover the authorization server, right? Authorization server discovery, right? And so that's the first part of the spec where I'm calling the MCP-protected resource, getting the resource metadata, I have the location of the authorization server, then I call the authorization server metadata endpoint, I get the client registration endpoint, dynamically register a client, now I have a client, right? Now I could perform an authorization grant flow, get the token, and then call the protected resource. That's the whole idea. It's very dynamic in nature, right? So what I'm going to do is we're going to go over this flow from a very high level first. I'm going to kind of do it in a couple sections. Yeah, my laptop's been doing some funny stuff here. Hold on a second here. Okay, looks like we're okay, but it might do this blank screen a couple of times. So what I'm going to do, I got this in a couple different parts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to walk through that flow that I just talked about from a very high level, just so we could kind of visualize the flow happening. Then we're going to dive into the code, see how we're going to customize Spring Security and Spring Authorization Server to realize this flow. And this is just going to be straight up OAuth 2. We're not going to include an MCP client or an MCP resource or MCP server at the first step. The second step is after we've realized this flow, then we're gonna auto-configure an MCP client, resource server, and leverage this flow, okay? So can everyone see that? Is that pretty legible or, yeah? It's a little bit small? Okay, let me see what I could do here. That's probably too big, but hold on a second here. How's that? Okay. All right, so first thing that happens, right? So as I was talking about that use case, I'm going to just drive on that use case. I'm on Claude desktop, right? I discover I want to be able to query the current weather, right? Can't do that with LLMs, right? Because they can't. They only have information at a certain point in time, and typically it's the past, right? They can't answer the question into the future. What's the current weather now? Or, I want to book some restaurants tomorrow, right? You can't do that. The only way you could do that is by adding, a tool, right? An MCP server that exposes a tool that ultimately provides additional context to the LLM. It discovers these tools and it realizes capabilities. And when you ask these questions, then it goes through this callback, right? Via the host application to the client, to the server to get the weather, right? So let's go over this case, right? So I'm on Cloud Desktop, I add the weather service, right? And I call the weather service without a token initially, right? With this first flow. What comes back is a 4.1 unauthorized, right? We get a www authenticate header, and in the header, we have this resource metadata parameter, right? So how that looks is, I got some requests here, and I'm gonna show you here. My first sample here, we're going to get to the weather service in the second part. The first part, where I'm just doing the standard OAuth flow, I just got a resource server that retrieves messages. Okay, so I'm going to execute this request here. I got things up and running, and as you can see here, this part here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. We'll go to 125. Let's see how that. Okay, as you can see, the www authenticate header, resource metadata. And so this is the protected resource metadata endpoint URL, right? So this isn't in Spring Security yet. We're looking to merge this in. But this is what comes back first, right? So we go back to this flow. Oops. Go back to this flow here. And then what happens is the client will extract that resource metadata parameter and then call the protected resource metadata endpoint, right? Let's do that now. We'll simulate that flow. So I'm calling that. And as you can see here, we have, resource identifier, authorization server. The rest is irrelevant. But the resource, this is equivalent to the issuer identifier, right? It's the unique identifier of that resource server, and it's typically an HTTPS URL. And then this is the most important part, is the authorization server. It could be one or more than one, right? So it's up to the client to choose which one. It might query all of them to see what capabilities it has. Ultimately, it needs a client registration endpoint, right, to fulfill this flow. So this is the next thing that happens. So comes back with the resource metadata, the client extracts the authorization server, and then it calls the authorization server metadata endpoint, as we can see in this part of the flow here. Go back here. Oops. Right? And then it calls the well-known OAuth 2 authorization server, comes back with the response. Now, I'm going to execute this one here. The authorization server metadata endpoint, we'll look at this. All right, so here's some information here. They share identifier, all the endpoints, the capabilities, client authentication methods. But the one thing that's missing here, I want to call this out, is the registration endpoint. So Spring Authorization Server has implemented the OpenID Connect registration endpoint, not the OAuth 2 Authorization Server one. So for this demo sample, I'm just leveraging the OpenID Connect registration endpoint just to realize that flow, right? We're going to implement that in an upcoming release. So I'm going to execute that one right now. the OpenID Connect one. And over here, as you can see, the bottom one there, the registration endpoint. Okay, so we'll go back to this flow, right? And we basically register the client, and then it comes back with client credentials, and then everything as is, right? Perform the authorization grant flow, authorization code, get or access token, and then call the MCP server and access the weather service or messages in this case. So that's the flow. So from a high level, that's the flow we're trying to implement. So how do we do this? How do we configure Spring Security's OAuth 2 client and resource server support and authorization server support to realize this flow? Let's jump into the code right now, because I know you guys are here for that more than anything. So let's check that out. Let's jump to, actually, let's do a demo. Let's go through the demo first. I already kind of logged in. Let me just log out. Okay, I'm going to log back in here. I just got OpenID Connect set up. I'm going to share a link to this repo later so you can play around with it. I'm going to ignore that because it's password. So there's two things here. So I said the first part, MCP authorization flow, this is standard OAuth 2. The second part is the weather service with MCP integrated. So go through this. As you can see, the client ID there, take note of that. I'm just going to go through the consent. Here's my messages hard-coded, pretty basic, right? But I'm going to do it again just so you can see. New client, right? So each time this sample's going through that flow every single time. It's discovering the authorization server, registering a new client, getting an access token, calling the resource server. Okay, so that's the demo, pretty basic. How does this look like? What do we got to do to realize this flow? What do we got to do to configure? So let's jump straight to the controller first. Go to the MCP authorization controller. So this is what's happening here. In the authorization, this is what's getting called, the MCP authorization. Get a registration ID. For those of you that are familiar with the OAuth 2 client support, each client registration is uniquely identified by a registration ID, just a unique identifier. And you could set up different clients, to perform an authorization code grant or client credentials, and you set up the client credentials, the scope that it requests, and so forth. Initially, this gets called, and there's no registration ID because we haven't registered a client, right? So it's just going to basically call the protected resource without an access token. 401's going to come back, and then I have my exception handler here. As you can see, it's catching that, right? And this is the flow right here, right? That's happening. I have two helper classes. I have this authorization server discoverer and this dynamic client registrar. These classes ultimately would be in Spring Security. But right now, like I said, all the code is here. There's definitely a lot of code. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to go over the key parts. So this authorization server discoverer, I'm going to parse the resource metadata URI, and this is where I'll call I'll do the discovery process, right? Like that first part of it. I'll call the protected resource metadata, extract the authorization server, call the authorization server metadata, extract the client registration endpoint. And now I'm going to register the client. This is just basically a logical name, the MCP client. I want this client to be able to perform the authorization client credentials grant. I set up the redirect URI. This is an important one here, the resource ID. So this is part of the spec here too, where so the relationship, there's one MCP client to one MCP server. It's always a one-to-one relationship, right? So you want to ensure that when an MCP client gets an access token, it could only call that one MCP server, right? And the way you would do that is by token audience binding, as in, I'm registering this client right now, and I'm adding custom metadata, specifically the resource identifier, right? And I'm adding this and associating this with the registered client, right? So the resource identifier. So that way, when it goes through an authorization grant flow, it checks, is this client allowed to request access to this resource server, right? Based on the resource identifier. It's the same idea as the scope, right? When a client is requesting a specific scope, is the scope registered? Is this client allowed to request the scope? Same idea, right? So that's what this is. And I'm going to show you how we configure this. And that's pretty much it. It registers it. I'm going to show how the configuration, we got to customize on the client and the authorization server and resource server. And then after it registers, I do a redirect here with the registration ID. I come back up here, and then now I'm replaying that request to the protected resource. I have the registration ID. It goes through the flow, gets the access token, calls it. Okay, so that's the controller logic, right? Okay, now how does that look like? What do we got to do to configure on the OAuth 2 client side? We're going to start there first. Let's go back here. Actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go in the order of the flow. So the first thing that happens is I need to be able to return the resource metadata parameter from the resource server when an access token is passed. So go to the resource server configuration. You're going to see the naming conventions here. When you clone this, you'll see authorization server config and then authorization server customizations. You'll see, resource server config, resource server customization. So everything, the customization classes, that's where all the customizations are, right? So logically named. Everything else is pretty standard configuration. So if you want to just jump to the custom configuration, you go to those classes. So let's jump to the resource server customizations first. And then this specific custom bearer token authentication entry point, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Now I'm leveraging the existing bearer token authentication entry point, and all I'm doing, I just got to add the resource metadata parameter to it. So that's what I'm doing here. Again, this is something that would live in Spring Security. You could take a look at this code, but it's pretty basic. This is the big one. This is the protected resource metadata endpoint filter. Again, I don't know if this is going to get into Spring Security 7. We'll have to see. Things are really tight these days, but we're going to get this in. But this is the configuration here, and I'm basically passing in a customizer. This following the same pattern. If you're familiar with customizing the authorization endpoint with Spring Authorization Server, there's a customizer. It accepts the builder, and then you could customize it, right? So here we're basically adding the authorization server, the scopes that it supports, bearer method support, and so forth, right? And then here, this is the resource identifier. And then basically we configure this in the resource server config. Over here, we're just adding that filter. And that's it for the resource server side. Pretty basic. We've got a filter, custom authentication entry point. So that's the first step. So the request comes into the resource server. There's no access token, triggers this custom bearer authentication entry point. Resource parameter comes back. Client extracts that, calls the resource metadata endpoint. That comes back with the authorization server, list of authorization server, extracts that, and then it calls the authorization server metadata endpoint. I don't have to show anything there because that's built into Spring Authorization Server, so that's all there, no customizations needed. Then we take the client registration endpoint from the OpenID Connect provider configuration endpoint, because that's what I'm using in my demo here, and then we do the dynamic client registration. Right? So let's look at that next, because there's some customizations because we're passing in the resource ID. We want to associate that custom resource ID with the registered client. So let's look at that. So we have authorization server config. This is all standard configuration. And then here we have the customizations. So this is the big one here, client registration endpoint, right? So this is the next step, right? The next step is we're registering a client. There's a list of resource identifiers that are passed in registration. I need to save that with the registered client. And this is where it's happening. So here we have I'll make this a little bit bigger. We have two authentication providers with the client registration endpoint. The client registration authentication provider, this handles the registration, and then the client configuration authentication provider. This allows you to read an existing client registration. I just configured it here. We're not going to talk about it. We're not concerned about it for this demo. So here we're configuring the client registration endpoint. There's two converters. I'm going to call it, input converter, output converter, as in input converter is client registration request comes in, that's the input, and the output is the registered client, which is the domain object of Spring Authorization Server. It represents a registered client. It's what's persisted with the client registration repository. So we got to configure that. And the output converter is, here's a registered client, give me a client registration response that I can return back to the client, right? So that it could get its client credentials and use that to perform an authorization grant flow. Let's look at one of those converters, the input converter, because that's the most important one. Here I'm leveraging the existing built-in client registration converter, and then I just need to enhance it. So the client settings, the registered client, again, if you're not familiar with Spring Authorization Server, this is the representation of the persisted registered client with Spring Authorization Server instance there. And there's a client settings that's associated with it. There's some standard settings, but this is also a facility where you can add custom settings, right? And so this is where we would add the list of resource identifiers, right? Just like we have scopes associated, these are the scopes that this client is allowed to request. Here are the resource identifiers that this client is allowed to access, right? So we're basically enhancing the client settings here and just adding it as a custom claim. I'm not going to get into the details there, but that's what that is. That's the configuration there. Okay, so now we've registered the client, we've associated the resource identifier. The client registration comes back with this, output converter, and now the client has client credentials, client ID, client secret, and now it needs to get an access token. It's going to go through the authorization code grant flow, and at the end of it, it's going to get an access token. But there's validation that needs to happen, right? Just like scope, this client's going requesting message read, this client's requesting this specific resource. Is it allowed to access this resource, right? So there's some validation that needs to happen. So we're going to go to Spring Authorization Server right now, configure how we're validating the resource parameter on the authorization request and the token request. We're going to do it in both, okay? But first we got to pass it. So let's go to the client. This is how it looks like from the client side. And client customizations. Okay, so we're going through the authorization code grant flow. The first phase is the authorization request. We've got to pass the resource parameter. So I'm leveraging the existing configuration that I have here, the Spring MCP client server configuration, which is the same one. So I'm just auto wiring that there. So that's what I'm using in my resource parameter. The OAuth 2 authorization request resolver is the component on the OAuth 2 client side where you could customize the authorization request. What's passed in there is the builder, the authorization request.builder. It's already initialized with the default parameters, and this is where we could customize. And what we want to do is we want to add the parameter. So it's simple as this, all right? So this allows us to pass the resource parameter. Before we get to the authorization server validation, let's look at the token request, the second phase of the authorization code grant flow. We want to also pass the resource parameter there as well. Now, I have access to the authorization exchange, which is the authorization request, authorization response. If I got to this point, then that validation succeeded, the authorization succeeded. So I'm going to just leverage the resource parameter that was passed in the authorization request and pass that along. And that's what this is doing here. Okay, so that's the client side, right? Authorization request configuration, passing the resource parameter and the token request. Now let's go to that's the client side. And now on the authorization server side, we got to set up those validations. So first on the authorization request endpoint here, we've got the authorization endpoint configure. We access that. Same idea here. We want to access the authentication providers. And then over here, we are configuring an extra validator. So the authorization code request authentication provider. So this is the authentication provider that handles the authorization request, and by default, we have a couple of validators: the redirect URI validator and the scope validator. We're going to leverage that as is, and we're going to add a new validator, the resource validator. So we'll look at that, and over here. We're not valid. We don't require the resource parameter on OpenID Connect flow. So as you can see here, we're just returning here, and then over here, so we're getting the resource IDs that are associated with the registered client's client settings. Right. So this is what was registered. We get that, and then we get the resource parameter from the authorization request. We do an exact match. If everything's good, proceed. If not, throw an exception, right? That's it for the authorization request validation. Now, for the token request validation, there's a couple things that need to happen, right? We got to validate it, but then we also got to add that resource identifier, and there might be more than one. Right now, we're just using one. We want to associate that to the audience claim in the JWT. I got JWT set up in the sample. We could have opaque, but I got JWT. So we want to add the audience claim, and we want to add the resource identifier in the audience claim, right? Because that's ultimately what's going to be verified as well on the resource server side. We'll get to that at a point in a second. So let's look at that. And the way we would do that, the hook for that is the OAuth 2 token customizer. Right, so as it says, it allows you to customize the token, whether it's an opaque token or a JWT. The claim, we're using JWT here based on the generic type here. So the claims are initialized by default, and then it calls the token customizer. So in here, we could add claims, we can modify existing claims, we could perform validation. So let's look at that. So I got a couple of, just a pre-check here. I only want to I only want to deal with access tokens, because this gets called for ID tokens, refresh tokens, and access tokens. I'm only dealing with access tokens here, right? So I'm doing a couple of pre-checks. Is this a callback for an access token, minting an access token? Okay, great. I don't want to deal with OpenID Connect tokens, and I don't want to deal with dynamic client registration tokens. I just want to deal with standard OAuth 2 authorization grant tokens. So this is just a pre-check, and then here's the validation, right? So I'm getting the resource parameter from the authorization request, the resource parameter from the token request, making sure it's an exact match. If it's good, proceed. If not, throw an exception. And then this is where I basically get the claims. This is the claims builder. So this is where I could modify the claims however I see fit. All I want to do here is I just want to add a claim, right? The audience claim. And then I add the resource parameter there. So that's it. That's it for the authorization server side. So at this very point, the client has completed the authorization code grant flow. The access token has come back, right? I've showed all the customizations. Now we're at the last step, right? We're replaying that request. Initially, we called without an access token, and now we're going to replay that same request, right? And then now we're going to basically, call the protected resource. In this case, the first part of this demo is call the messages resource server with the access token. And there's validation that needs to happen there too, right? Because that token is bound to one resource server, and we got to ensure that access token that's being passed that resource server is meant for itself, right? So let's look at that, and that's a pretty easy one. We'll go to resource server customizations. So the JWT decoder here, this is the standard component for validating JWTs. And we're just going to leverage the existing validators, and we're just going to add a new one, right? We're going to add the JWT audience validator, and we're just going to pass in the resource identifier, right? So ultimately, this is what's going to happen here when the JWT comes in. Obviously, it's going to verify the signature first, and it's going to apply the default validators, and then it's going to get the audience claim, and it's going to ensure the value that in the audience claim is the same as this value that's being passed in, right? And that basically completes the flow, right? We've completed the flow. These are all the customizations. This is just straight up OAuth 2. But it is MCP authorization. When you look at the spec, this is the MCP authorization spec, right? Now, how can we integrate this flow into an actual MCP client and MCP server, right? So let's do that next. I just got to do a time check though. I don't have a time on there. That thing's stuck. 1:16. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So let's go to the demo. We'll just start at the demo here. I'm probably logged out. Okay. I'm not. Since Rob is in Kansas. Okay. So I'm going to check the weather here. Okay, I like this. Like this, gives a lot of context. I gotta give a little bit more context, right? I'm gonna do Kansas City, Missouri. I'll just type that. And it's gonna come back with the weather, and then we're gonna go through. Yeah, okay, hold on. Let me see, maybe I typed it wrong. I'm gonna type Toronto, that's where I'm from. I probably typed it wrong. Let's see here. If it's not working, we're gonna move on. Yeah, something's going on. It's probably a network issue. But you know what? We're not going to get into that. We'll just assume it works. Because the most important thing is I want to be able to show you, right, how to configure it. Who cares, right? It never fails. Okay, so let's start with the MCP server, because that one's the easiest one to configure and integrate. So obviously, we gotta set up Spring AI and the MCP Java SDK. I've already set that up, but I'm just going to jump into, we obviously got to set up our standard properties to trigger the Spring AI auto configuration. We set up our server, and not much there, but this just triggers the instantiation of an MCP server, right? And then here's my weather service that doesn't work right now, but I'm just using this third-party API. It just passes in a latitude, longitude, right? But the key part here is, and if you know Spring AI, it's the annotations, right? The tool parameter, right? And ultimately, this gets discovered, right? This gets registered, and this gets discovered, and the LLM model knows about this tool. I'm not going to get into the whole details, but ultimately, this ends up being like a JSON schema, right? And this description gets added there, and the parameters get added there, and the LLM, receives this JSON schema as part of the context when the request comes in, and it knows, well, I don't know what the weather is, but this tool does, right? And I know based on the schema, I need these two parameters, right? So it figures out the latitude, longitude, and then it passes it, and then this gets called back, right? But ultimately, there's a lot more going on there, and I'm still, learning the whole AI world. It's definitely there's definitely a lot going on there, but this is pretty basic, right? This is a basic service, and all I got to do is register it, right? Using this method tool callback provider. And that's it. That's all I got to do on the MCP server side. Pretty basic, right? Everything is really, all the intelligence, or more like the complexity, is in the client side. So let's look at that next. Okay, so MCP client customizations. Now, this part here, okay, the client transports, this is literally a cut, copy, and paste from the auto configuration, right? So I had to actually exclude it in the client application here. I had to exclude this auto configuration. I'm using the service and events transport. We're gonna eventually use the streamable HTTP. It is in snapshot, and the MCP Java SDK, the client streamable HTTP is implemented, and the server. But Spring AI's latest version is not using that version of the SDK. So that's what I had to do in this sample. I had to just exclude the auto configuration. I just copied that this bean configuration because I ultimately had to add this specific customization, this HTTP request customizer. Right? This was added in MCP Java SDK 0.11. And if I look at this interface here, standard pattern, right? I want to be able to customize the request before the request actually is sent, right? Standard pattern. So this is a new interface. So ultimately, I want to be able to, add the authorization bearer, access token to the request before it's actually sent, right? So I got to implement this component, right? I got to implement that MCP authorization flow with this component. So let's look at that. So yeah, this bean is gone when the next Spring AI version is released. So this component here, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot going on. And again, this is a demo repo, and we're going to continuously iterate on that and reduce the code. So ultimately, from a user perspective, it's not going to look like what I'm showing you right now. So don't be scared because it's quite a bit. But this is the component, and I'm just going to, kind of jump to a couple of key parts here. So the first thing I'm doing when this callback gets called is I have two clients, right? I got a service-based client registration and a with user, right? So during the and I know it's not the term that's used with MCP, but I like to say a handshake, right? When the MCP client initializes, right, with the MCP server or does that handshake, and the capabilities are exchanged and the version are exchanged, there's no user, right? I don't need an access. This is like a service to service kind of call, right? So client credentials flow, getting an access token makes a lot of sense. That's what this is called, service-based client registration. That is a client registration that implements the that's configured for the client credentials flow, and the other one is when I'm actually checking the weather, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I just got to register these clients, right? This looks exactly the same, but I got weather.read here instead of message.read. And I'm going to just kind of jump down to the code here, and this looks familiar, right? This is the same thing that we looked at in the MCP authorization controller, right? I'm calling the request, or calling the MCP server, get a 401, extract the resource metadata, and go through the flow and ultimately register the clients. And at the end of that, if I go back to this hook, at this point, I call the access, I modify the request, add the authorization header with the bearer token, and get the access token. And these two here, these are all OAuth 2 client components. I'm just using the authorized client manager to perform the client credentials for, or the authorization code grant flow. So I'm not going to get too much into this detail, but this is basically how you would hook in the MCP authorization flow into the MCP client. Okay. I got 6. Okay, good. No, I'm just doing a tech check there, or time check. Okay, cool. All right, so that's it. So a lot of the work was in that first part, right? Even without including MCP client server. MCP server, I didn't have to do anything else. Everything's there, right? There's no other changes there as far as OAuth 2 specific configuration goes. But the OAuth 2 client code in this request interceptor. It's a lot. There's definitely work to do in the MCP Java SDK and the Spring AI auto configuration, but we're going to get there. But the one thing I also wanted to point out is the MCP spec came out in November, right? Like super recent, super new, with no authorization section, right? Then that came out in March, the first, version of the authorization. And then there was a, fairly big change in the latest one, which is June, right? So, I don't know about you, like, sure, I like to be on the bleeding edge, but I don't like to release on the bleeding edge. I want to just iterate. I want to see, when things are stable. So this is a good repo, to play around with. I do want to point out, though, that all that code that I just showed you is going to go in, or most of it is already here. So take note of that. It's in the Spring AI community. And under MCP security, right? There's samples there you could play around with as well. But everything that I showed you is going to go into here. We're going to constantly iterate in here and constantly just reduce the code. These samples will get smaller and smaller as we see more stability in the spec. Because on that note, and I want to point this out, is this, a sec here. This was just logged 3 weeks ago. So this is a new proposal to the MCP authorization. It's actually a very significant proposal. It actually removes all OAuth 2 out of the MCP client, right? So that's pretty big, right? So things are moving so quick, right? So I'm really tracking this. And, but in a nutshell, it's proposing HTTP message signing between the client and the server. So removing all OAuth 2 from the client and using HTTP message signing between the client and the server. OAuth is still going to live on the MCP server side. That's just a very high level, but that's a significant change, right? So not in a rush to merge things into Spring Security and Spring Authorization Server, given how things are moving very quickly. We got to see some stability. But like I said, definitely keep track of this repository. We're going to constantly iterate on this and just see where things go. As things change on the spec, we will change it in here. And when there's more stability, things will get merged into, Spring Security, Spring Authorization Server, MCP Java SDK, and Spring AI. Yeah. That's pretty much it. I got 2 minutes left. So there's the link to the repo. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm happy to answer your questions, but come and see me. I'd rather kind of do the one-on-one because sometimes I just can't hear. It's right. So yeah, thank you.